on one of the patrons on Patreon. Sharon Tuck, good to see you here from Toronto. Andor Warche from British Columbia, Canada. Adora Guy from Louisiana, good to see you guys. I'll greet a few more of you. I just want to let you guys know what the program is. I've got it written down here. I'm not sure how much we get through, but the idea is to, first of all, focus on the Brian Laundrie side of the Gabby Petito case and look at the possible influence of substances. And then we're going to deal with Brian Laundrie, hearing voices. What could that mean? Could that be this? Could it be schizophrenia? I'm going to say why I don't think it is. We're also going to be looking at Amanda Knox, depending on how long this goes on for, the Brian Laundrie thing, and dealing with your questions. And then after that, possibly Summer Wells. And then I'm also going to be talking to you guys a little bit about psychosis in general and neurosis, how they're different, how they apply in this case, and then possibly we'll do some Ernest Becker. I'm not sure if we will definitely go into Amanda Knox. Depends just on how quickly we get through everything. Sharon Tuck says the live has just started. Yeah, the live has just started. Kathy B says, good to see you, Nick, missed you. It has been a while since I've been up. I think it's about 3 weeks since I've done a live. Happy Thanksgiving to you guys. I hope you guys have had a good weekend. I hope you've had a sort of the right weekend, if I can put it that way. I hope you've felt fulfilled, satisfied, that you've connected in the way that maybe you need to connect to certain things. Terry Dean says, missed you. And Timmy is just down there, lying down. I'll call him in a moment. Claire says, catching my first live. Thank you. Thanks, Claire. Teresa Nelson says, happy Thanksgiving weekend. Sabrina Ramsey says, hello, everyone. That is actually something I also want to touch on is, can we compare, is there any intertextuality between Brian Laundrie and Burke Ramsey? And we are coming up on the 25-year anniversary of the John Benet Ramsey case in about a month's time. Are there any similarities between Brian Laundrie and Burke Ramsey and a little bit beyond those individuals? So we're going to talk about that in a second. Carrie Ross, Timmy living his best doggy life, that's for sure. Peen Packfist says, you look rested. Do I? I suppose I feel fairly rested. I've certainly had a relaxing run up to this particular live. Sometimes it's quite chaotic. And so sometimes that spills over into the live. Susan Becker, thank you very much. What did you say there? Number 1. Oh, that's pretty cute. Cool. Thanks a lot. Healing Vibration says, Nick, thank you for your commitment to these cases. Thank you. Margie, hi. Tina Maturiz, Zenaida Rivera. Good to see you. So I think we're going to get started when we're at the modest number of 200. I don't think there's that many people in, so we'll get going at about 200 people watching. Angela, thank you very much. Colleen Sulik, good to see you. Ruby Slippers, cool name. I'd really appreciate your last video, educational. Good to hear that. Lisa Lasky, thanks for that. Lorraine Kavalkovich, to all who celebrate Thanksgiving and to those who don't, blessings to all. You know, even if you don't celebrate Thanksgiving, we don't in South Africa, but it's certainly something we're aware of And, I had a kind of a biggish dinner with friends, and it wasn't Thanksgiving, but it sort of felt like that. And because we're aware of it, you sort of, I think you psychologically acknowledge it. You don't necessarily do exactly what other people do. We didn't eat turkey, but we did have a barbecue. Sometimes other groups have certain religious festivals, and other people are certainly aware of it. Not saying Thanksgiving is necessarily that, but I think you get what I'm talking about. Sweep Singh says, sounds like tonight is as usual going to be super informative. Thanks from Scotland. I must say it's feeling a lot like Scotland right now in South Africa. It's just strange weather. It's snowing in November, late November. We're the Southern Hemisphere. It should be summer here. It is raining constantly. Not that that's totally unusual, but the cold and the rain together is quite strange. Along the way, says hi, good to see you. Robin Rain, hello everyone, good to see you. Bria Lace, good to see you. I think Bria's signing in from France. I hope you're getting over your jet lag. Angela Gallagher says, always enjoy your content and deep thinking. So by the way, this live is kind of going to continue on where the other one left off. So I kind of didn't want to touch on some sensitive subject matter in that episode. I'm going to kind of wade into that area in this one. We're going to talk about certain substances and what impact that they could have, and how relevant that might be. Bria says, I'm all good now. That's good to hear. Stargirl says, very windy in the UK yesterday. Oh, really? It seems like there's a lot more moisture in the air of the world. Don't you agree? There's just a lot more, maybe people in California don't agree, but it feels like there's a lot more moisture swirling around. South Africa is supposed to be a dry country, and so it seems to be raining everywhere, which is unusual. Michelle Atkinson, hi from England. It's snowing here. Love your videos. Oh, snowing there before Christmas, well before Christmas. Something I want to just share with you just before I get started. I saw this newspaper while I was on holiday, right? And it's in Afrikaans, so if you don't understand the words, don't worry. It's Afrikaans, and I bought it because of this story here, right? And it's got to do with Riva Steenkamp. It's the young woman that was murdered by Oscar Pistorius, and it's because of her that I actually got into true crime. I wrote my first book of over 100 books was on Riva in her own words. And, it's been a very short period of time, and now Oscar's apparently coming up for parole. At the same time, Rudy Gaudet is also out of prison, although he went to prison something like 6 or 7 years before Oscar did. Still, he came out 14 years early. I'm talking about Rudy Gaudet. Kid Lisa, thank you very much. Thanks for the time, thought, and research. Buffy says some words are Dutch. Yeah. So this is an Afrikaans newspaper. I bought it when I was in Plettenberg Bay on the garden route. And as I said, I bought it for this story on Riva Steenkamp. And it basically is just talking about her parents wanting to meet Oscar. And, that article is here on page 5. Not sure if I can find it for you. Basically, this article here. If you can see it there, over there, right? So apologies for it's quite difficult to show you the paper because it's still the original paper. But the thing that was really, really strange and pretty unfortunate and pretty upsetting was, so I bought the newspaper, I read the article, I folded the newspaper up, put it aside, and then I was not sure what I was doing, but I happened to look at the newspaper again. I was sort of daydreaming, I happened to look at the newspaper again, and I noticed this person here. And this person is a friend of mine. It's someone who is on my phone. So I'm using my phone now to do this live stream. We'd sent hundreds of messages to one another about certain cases. His name is Thomas Mollett, and it turns out that he had died just a few days earlier. And he's someone that I discussed the Oscar Pistorius case with. I discussed other cases with. So he's basically a friend of mine, a close personal friend of mine in the true crime community, but someone who's also an author, someone who's also an investigator, someone who actually participates in court cases, is a forensic investigator, and we'd had lunches together and we'd sat in courtrooms together, and so it was quite a shock and quite a nasty surprise seeing his picture there, and the fact that this guy is also 50 years old, and he's now no longer with us. So it was just pretty troubling and upsetting to see that, and it was basically almost on the same page where Reva's parents were deciding to see Oscar. You saw this guy, and I wonder whether Oscar possibly getting parole didn't feature into this guy's depression. I wonder whether that didn't have an impact on his depression. I just wonder, because I know when I heard about Oscar getting parole, I found it quite a distressing thought. Wow, he's already up for parole, someone who's convicted of murder, and we don't like to have that situation where someone's actually convicted and then they come out so early, right? Lisa Arnold says, you have had a lot of loss recently. Condolences. Thanks for that. Stargirl says, you were meant to pick up that paper again. Yeah. Pauline Buckles, good to see you here. Says, hello, I thought this was going to be 11:50 PST. Not quite. A Batman, okay, good to see you. So I see we almost at 200. Let's just see Cynthia Berg. Yeah, it is pretty. The friend of mine looks like he committed suicide. He did have depression. So I think, it's possible that, I think it's a combination of things. I think he got divorced recently, or fairly recently. I think I know he was covering the Jason Roeder case, also the Oscar Pistorius case, and I think some of what is going on in those cases was possibly quite depressing, that there's just this lack of legal progress in a way. So I do feel quite sad that he didn't contact me, that he didn't reach out to me just saying, need someone to talk to or something like that. I did notice when we spoke, when we interacted, he spoke a heck of a lot. He just was like this fountain. And a lot of times when people speak like that, just this fountain of words, non-stop, it is often a sign that they're alone or lonely, that they don't have a lot of people to actually talk to. And often people that do just talk, often put other people off. It's just like, well, I want a chance to speak, or what is actually going on here. So I just want to say to you guys, if you encounter someone like that, try to put yourself aside a little bit, try and make yourself available, try and get to what is going on behind those words, right? There might be a sense of being alone, right? So just something I wanted to share with you guys. Okay, so we are at over 200. Let's just see the last comments here. Depression in men seems to always be fatal. I had depression but reached out. I think men who are depressed feel, how on earth do you begin to acknowledge that? Like, how do you start that conversation? Because other men will almost immediately just be like, well, wow, you are weak and you are needy. And you know what I mean? Whereas I think when you have that conversation with a woman, they are immediately sensitive, kind, listening, approachable. You know what I mean? It seems like a bit of a double standard between the sexes, but yeah. Sackville B says the wisdom is why I watch your channel. Okay, so I'm going to get started. I'm going to put this down. And I'm going to start off with Brian Laundrie and Burke Ramsey, right? Now, what I want you to think about, and I've certainly been thinking about it since Brian Enton did the show on Banfield, where he spoke to Lawrence Gablinski, and they were speaking quite, there was also an ex-FBI agent, and they were speaking kind of quite frankly about the possibility of the parents being seen as possibly aiding and abetting, possibly obstructing justice, possibly accessories after the fact, right? And it just got me thinking of like a scenario of where you have a son and parents, and a scenario of the parents not talking to the authorities and lawyers getting involved. And I just started thinking about the John Benet Ramsey case. And I just started thinking, how similar is this to the John Benet Ramsey case? Now, it doesn't really matter whether you think Burke Ramsey is innocent or guilty. What matters is the fact that the grand jury, this is in terms of the John Benet Ramsey case, thanks Bridget, what matters is in terms of the John Benet Ramsey case, the grand jury voted to indict the parents for accessory, right? When John Ramsey was asked about that, he was like, well, what is that? What is, I don't even know what that means. Don't know if you guys remember that. So what I'm trying to say is, I just wonder to what extent these are similar, right? And also wonder to what extent could we have the same outcome, even if they are similar. So in the John Benet Ramsey case, nothing really happened to the parents. So there was a suspicion among certain people that the parents had assisted somebody. And I don't really want to go into the merits of exactly what happened in the John Benet Ramsey case. I just want to compare it broadly to Brian Laundrie and the Laundrie parents. I think it's quite an interesting subject. Carrie Ross says, it's amazing to me how prolific Nick is with his career. Super impressive. Well, Carrie Ross, I'm not married. I don't have children. And I do tend to get very caught up in my work. And that, I think, helps to be prolific. So I'm not writing books anymore, though. I'm not saying I've retired from writing them, but where I was writing a book a month, I'm now not writing a book in 3 months, 6 months. I think right now is the longest stretch that I haven't written a book. Stargirl says, I hope I'm not speaking out of turn. I hope the Laundries are not convicted. I think they must have been in a horrible position. So that's the question is, first, I think part of the question is, what is the intent of Gabby Petito's family? How do they feel? Bear in mind, it's not just about Brian. It's not just about Brian and what happened to Brian. It's also that Gabby Petito was murdered, and then there was people who had a certain amount of information, crucial, critical, strategic, time-sensitive information that could have been conveyed earlier and wasn't. And I think what that then raises is the question, what story did Brian tell his family when he got home? Because it's possible that he told a story that was quite convincing to them. He could actually have said to them, Mom, Gabby decided to continue on with Rose Davis, or not even mention her name. Gabby decided she wanted to continue with another friend of hers. We weren't really getting along, or something like that. And it may have been quite plausible, just not true. And so is it their fault if they believed a story that wasn't true? On the other hand, when the information came out that Gabby was missing, why wouldn't they just contact people and be forthright about it? That certainly raises a different aspect to it. So I think the question that is raised, and so I think a clever way of addressing the question is you move the question out of the Brian Laundrie case, where you might say, well, you're a bit contaminated in your thinking, or it's not clear. So let's take the question into the John Benet Ramsey case, see what we think about that, then bring it back to the Brian Laundrie case and the Laundries, right? And so the question is it okay to remain silent and sort of inert amidst an investigation into those closest to you? Let me say that again. Is it okay, meaning is it legally defensible? Is it ethical to remain silent and sort of inert? I'm just not going to do anything. I'm not going to say anything amidst an active investigation into those closest to you, right? So let's look at what you guys say. Susie says, perhaps Brian blocked the Petito's phone numbers on his parents' cell phones. Susan Becker says, good analogy, thanks for that. Louise says, shameful if they did not answer Gabby's parents' call. You never know if Brian had said something like, Gabby cheated on me, or Gabby dumped me, or something like that, where her parents may have felt, or his parents may have felt, wow, you've treated our son really badly. I don't know, it could have a different kind of impact. Margie says, legally, yes, but morally, I think not. Louise says, unethical, definitely. Now, so the question is this obstruction? Is this obstruction of justice, or is it the right to remain silent? And I must say, that's where my sort of legal expertise where I've got to sort of admit I'm not a legal expert to see through that, because it's certainly quite murky to say you absolutely have the right to remain silent. Anyone does. You have the right to remain silent. But in a situation like this, it certainly feels like obstruction. But then if you look at the John Benet Ramsey case, wasn't there obstruction there? And then ultimately nothing happened there. So, and I do think the authorities are in an awkward position if, to the extent that they pursue the family members, so they pursue the person that is not directly involved, but the next level, they literally pursue them, then the response may be, well, we're not going to talk. We're not going to cooperate because we could implicate ourselves. And to some extent, that makes sense. But on the other hand, how can you implicate yourself by mistake? And why wouldn't you see it the other way and say, well, I want to be transparent because I haven't done anything wrong and I don't know that somebody else has done something wrong, right? In other words, if you've got something to hide, wouldn't you continue to hide and cover and obstruct, right? That's the question. Karen, Cat Mom says, please press the like button. Jamie says they are going to be charged with something. That's the question. I don't know if they will be. I think it's possible, and certainly the fact that the FBI are keeping the case, the cards of the case so close to their chests suggests that they're quite serious about this. Betty Bolton says, why the burner phone? And that's a really good point. So that brings us to the next point, which is, why did Brian Laundrie's parents not reveal to the public that he was armed, right? So you may have certain reasons that you wouldn't say certain things right, in one area. But there's also the other area, which is the public interest, which is where you say, doesn't the neighborhood, don't society have a need to know certain critical information, right? And I think the answer in this is a sort of a tentative yes. And I think when I make this point, I think some of you are going to vehemently disagree with me. Some of you may agree, and this is my point, is I think this came up in the news yesterday, and I think what the response was from the Laundrie's lawyer, and correct me if I'm wrong, as far as I understood, the response was that they were aware that a weapon was missing, and they didn't communicate this because they were also aware that there was a frenzy going on about their son, and they were worried that information, that he was possibly armed, would cause him to be in danger, would cause the frenzy to get worse. And let's be honest about what we're talking about. We're talking about the situation outside the Laundrie home, where you had people on bullhorns, and you had people camped there, and you had people getting more and more confrontational, more and more aggravated. You also had people going to their daughter's home, Cassie's home. You had the case going national and arguably international. And so I think you could make the case that if you gave this information, that guess what, Brian's out there, number two, is armed. Isn't that going to lead to the people searching for him arming themselves, and the people involved in the sort of case in general possibly also arming themselves, and perhaps also the people on the lawn arming themselves, right? Can you imagine if it became kind of public knowledge at the time that Chris Laundrie owns 10 guns and one gun is missing, and Brian is out there, and possibly there's some kind of thing going on between the Laundries, but there are 10 guns out there. Can you imagine what social media, what YouTube creators could have come up with? And so it could have really led to a escalation in tensions, but also kind of almost a vigilante situation, which we can talk about other cases, other things that have happened right now. But my position is just maybe they were correct in not disclosing that. And let's also include the fact that law enforcement must have known this as well and chose not to disclose that. So what do you guys think? So I just want to put the ball in your court. Do you think that it was the right decision not to disclose the fact that Brian was armed? If you think that it was the right decision not to disclose that, put a 1. If you think it was the wrong decision, it was in the public interest, put a 2. Let's see what you guys say. Phyllis says, I must settle down now and listen. Okay. So I see a couple of 1s, a couple of 2s. Jeanette Hopkins, 1, a couple of 2s. I almost see it as 50-50 now. Now there seem to be more 2s than 1s. So now I'm seeing quite a lot of 2s. Amy Bauer put up a 1. Pauline Buckles says, bad decision, 1. Okay, so let me just repeat that. If you think that they should not have, it was the right decision not to say that he was armed, put a 1. And if you think they actually should have said that he was armed, put a 2. Bria Lace also puts up a 2. The Kitty Cat Network says that info could have compromised the investigation. Karen says it was the right thing to do not to reveal he had a gun. Okay. Lotus Petal says 50-50. I think that's quite a good answer. So Sarah Glenn says, what difference would it have made? So I would say this is just my personal opinion. I tend to feel that it was the right decision not to make it public that Brian was armed, because I do think you could have had a situation where, because there were people that were like bounty hunters that were taking it upon themselves to search for him, and I think you could really have had a situation where, think about that guy that they mistook on the Appalachian Trail for Brian. It wasn't Brian, but now think about how much worse that could have been if there was this perception that he's armed and dangerous. So, that guy, I think, came quite close to something happening to him, totally unfairly, because it wasn't Brian Laundrie. And so you can tell law enforcement, you can say to law enforcement, guys, this guy's armed, and then that's fine. But you have the public feeding into that, and YouTube is feeding into that, can really create a sense of tension and a sense of sort of trigger happiness, right? Which I think we've seen in some court cases lately that can happen. I don't really want to go into that beyond that, but I do think my first thought was that I didn't think it was right to withhold information from the public, just be transparent about what's going on. But my second thought was that it did make sense that there was actually kind of a frenzy going on, and something could happen. Something could happen with heated arguments outside the Laundrie home and all that kind of thing. Not interested, put up a 2. Sigrid says past 300 now. I'm actually quite surprised that there's so many people here sort of during Thanksgiving. Tapo EMT says, hey Nick, Tapo's got a picture of Gabby as a sort of angel, as an avatar. Pian Puckfist says that wouldn't happen in Canada with our gun laws. Okay. Why do you say that? SP says there was so much attention on this case, innocent lookalikes could have been killed. Absolutely. And you can almost imagine if the word went out from all the YouTubers that, guys, Brian is armed and dangerous, sort of look, watch your backs kind of thing. You could have had a situation of people thinking they're seeing Brian Laundrie and look alike Brian Laundrie is being shot or something like that. Right? So, but ultimately, I agree with Leah Vogel, who says, I don't think he was actually a danger to anyone else. Ultimately, I think that is true. Carrie Ross says, I don't think Brian was in a quiet neighborhood just jogging. Good point. Sharon says, Nick should work for the FBI. Okay. So that brings us to the next thing. That brings us to the next thing, which I actually really wanted to deal with in the previous video that I did, hearing voices. And this is really a fascinating topic. I did some additional research on this after putting up some analysis on Patreon, and it's really, really fascinating. Before I deal with this, I just want to refer to this. So do any of you know what psychosis basically means? So when we talk about Brian hearing voices, we're talking about psychosis. And so do you guys know what psychosis means in sort of everyday language? Let's see what you guys say. And please don't Google it. What do you understand by the word psychosis? So Songbird has nailed it, out of touch with reality, right? If you're suffering with psychosis, you are just losing track of reality. So Batman says you're a lunatic. Yvonne Phillips says break with reality. Good to see you, Yvonne. Louise says you'd make a terrific lecturer. I have actually lectured a little bit, and I wouldn't mind doing it a bit more. Andar Warrior says delusions. Sackville B says distortion of reality. Sweepsing says mental break from reality. Julie says it's a blurred lines between reality and fantasy. Susan Becker says hearing things. So all of that is broadly correct, but it's basically losing touch with reality. Now, I think there's a perception that somebody else has psychosis, right? And I must say, I wouldn't mind psychosis coming into the vocabulary, the terms that we use often in true crime, far more than narcissism. I think it's a far more applicable word. It's a general term, but I think it's far more applicable than narcissism. In the same way, this idea that someone else is always a narcissist, I think there's this idea that someone else is always suffering from psychosis. And if you think about it, psychosis is just losing touch with reality. And the reality is, at some time or another, all of us can lose touch a little bit with reality. You just not, in other words, when you're unrealistic, you to some extent losing touch with reality. When you're not practical about something, you're losing touch with reality. You can do that a little bit, and it's kind of normal, but you can also do it excessively, and you can do it extremely, to an extreme amount, and that's when it becomes something like schizophrenia. I think a really good way of describing it is to compare psychosis to neurosis, right? And of course, I'm just giving you my assessment of it. So you might go to someone else who says, no, well, it's like this. So this is my version of how I understand it, based on my research, based on my study, based on my knowledge. Psychosis is losing touch with reality, but it's kind of like expanding reality for reality to be all sorts of things that are sort of, it's sort of like really opening the door to like a world of possibility. But I mean, a lot of them are just totally nonsense or nonsensical. Fictions, ghosts, conspiracy theories, UFOs. It's just basically anything goes, right? So it's almost like if you think of someone losing touch with reality, it's like anything you suggest to them, they're like, yeah, I think that could be possible, right? Whereas neurosis is constricting reality. It's limiting reality to a certain extent. And so you can almost imagine that someone that is highly neurotic has, say, a fetish where they, let's say in a sexual sense, they see one very small part of a person as being something that attracts them. They are too afraid of the full person, so they reduce the person to a handbag or a shoe or a foot or a toe, whatever, and then that becomes their neurosis kind of thing. But in other words, it's reducing something to a manageable chunk. Psychosis is the opposite. You totally lose touch with reality. You totally lose a sense of scale. And schizophrenia is a good example of when that goes to an extreme, because what happens is you've now created almost like a split self. There's now additional self that is dealing with this fake world. And so it's just totally, how can I put it? It's totally out of whack with reality, right? It's totally, there's one reality and now suddenly there are multiple realities kind of thing. So the basic thing is that psychosis expands interpretations of reality excessively, unrealistically, while neurosis constricts it and limits it, right? And I think a good way for you to quickly measure your level of psychosis or neurosis is your attitude to death. In other words, is it realistic or is it fantastic or is it fictional? Or is it very limited, that death's just this little thing, it's nothing? Death's just one bad day in your life kind of thing. How realistic is your attitude to death? How practical is it? There's another aspect that I think is also useful. I'm just trying to remember what it was. I think social media is also an excellent way to look at the world's psychosis and the world's neurosis, because let's face it, on social media, when you do something like put up a post or put up a selfie or put up something, or if you're consuming social media, you're reducing all of a person to a single little soundbite, right? Social media is a little bit different to television or a movie. It tends to be quite a limited little fraction of information. And we also limit ourselves by saying, this is who I am, and there's your post, right? But did you know that social media can be both psychotic and neurotic at the same time? In other words, it can be limiting your world, but also expanding it in a totally unrealistic way. And what I mean by that is, so if you live your life through social media, then you're quite neurotic, and you're capable of being quite neurotic. Talking about everything you do is through social media. All your communications aren't with real people, it's through that, right? That's the one side of it. But the other side of it is, you can also consume so much social media that it's also kind of psychotic, in the sense that one person is only supposed to have so many friends, so many engagements, so many lives that they keep track of, so many other people where they can see what is going on in their lives. And social media kind of makes it possible for all of these fantastical realities, which aren't really reality, to be part of our daily kind of consumption. And it's kind of unrealistic, not only the amount that we have access to, but what we are getting access to. So it's not like we're getting access to the warts and all reality of another person. We're getting access to the curated fantasy, the curated fairy tale of this person, that person, that person, that person. And, if you're someone who's totally obsessed with celebrities, plural, and you're following all of these celebrities, and you can see exactly what they're doing day to day, especially if they're putting it up all the time, then it's almost like your whole life becomes a fantasy of their lives, which is a fantasy anyway, right? But that also makes you neurotic, because you've now limited your experience to life to being a voyeur of theirs, if that makes sense. And I think you can take some of this into Gabby and Brian, and them turning their marriage, essentially, they were supposed to get married, turning their marriage essentially into a social media experiment. And obviously what was happening in reality and what was happening in that weren't true. And so what is happening? Think about that, going into these vast landscapes, but only giving you a limited view of what's really happening there. So it's quite interesting. Colleen Sulik, I have times when I feel neurotic, when you want everything to be perfect and make myself crazy trying to achieve that outcome. I think when you can recognize that you are doing something, then you're not extremely so. When you absolutely can't, you've totally lost touch with reality, or you are totally caught up in your own neurosis. So the fact that you can see it means you're still healthy. That's a good sign. A copy of a copy of a copy, yeah. So in terms of Brian, we know that he was hearing voices, and that is a sign of psychosis. And I've heard quite a few people saying psychosis, hearing voices, schizophrenia. I'll tell you why I don't think that Brian has schizophrenia. First of all, because Gabby loved him. I don't think Gabby would have loved Brian if he was an obvious schizophrenic. I don't think Gabby would have wanted to marry Brian if he was obviously had a split personality. I'm talking about where the mental illness is so extreme that you can say, oh, he's got schizophrenia, right? And I'm not saying that my assessment is very scientific or very, sophisticated. Just that we tend to be quite quick to say, wow, I wonder if that person didn't have this disorder. We look at someone like Chris Watts. I'm pretty sure he was this kind of narcissist with that. Well, the people around him didn't pick that up. Gabby's parents didn't think that there was anything wrong with Brian, right? I think Brian's own parents didn't think that there was really anything wrong with him. He was bizarre. So there was something bizarre about Brian. I think Rose Davis said that she thought it was strange. I think they would go to the beach, or they'd go somewhere, I think the beach, and then he'd set up their hammocks, Gabby and Brian's hammocks, Gabby and Rose's hammocks, and then Brian would go and sit somewhere else. So he seemed like a bit of an oddball. But I think even Rose Davis, who I'm not sure if she was all that approving of Brian, kind of gave him the benefit of the doubt. She just thought that he was jealous and he had issues, but I don't think she ever used the word schizophrenic. So, you really want to follow the people closest to these people, and if they come up with certain terms like OCD or this or that, there's a much better chance that they are those things than a total outsider, right? Water Loving Dog says Brian had too much affect to have schizophrenia. I also thought that Brian responded during the Moab incident in a way that was quite convincing. Someone who's totally out of touch with reality, who's got a screw loose, isn't going to pull that off very well, right? Susan says, I think sexual attraction played a role as they dated very young. I think that's a very good point from Susan. I think you can also imagine that the sexual aspect was very potent and powerful and important for especially Brian. I think it was part of what validated him, but it was also something that you can imagine. You can imagine that if Brian felt that he was going to lose Gabby, he was also going to lose that aspect. He was going to lose this, the ability to have these encounters and these experiences. And, if Brian felt that he perhaps didn't deserve Gabby, or that Gabby was out of his league, once that was over, well, then wouldn't it be over from then on? Like he would, if that makes sense. CK says hearing voices is typical of about 70% of schizophrenics. That may be the case, but I still don't think that Brian had schizophrenia. And I'm going to go into what I think was the case. So Eliyahu says cannabis-induced psychosis. I think that is definitely a possibility here. And the reason why I like that statement is because there are clues in their social media. So in other words, if you're going to come up with an opinion, it's got a much better chance of being valid if it's anchored in the evidence, in what these people do and say, than just you snapping your finger and saying, well, 70% of people have that. So I want to give two quick examples of why I do think that substances could be a factor, and why one substance in particular. Now, I do remember someone saying, don't blame weed, because weed actually makes you relax, and it's the last thing that is going to cause you to be violent. Weed calms you down. And the fact is, weed can make you paranoid when you're coming off it, right? So I agree with that aspect. And something that's also quite interesting is there are two substances in weed that have contradictory impacts. I wish I had that literature right in front of me. I did read it earlier today. The one substance makes you more paranoid. The other substance can soothe you. They're separate substances. And so someone did make the argument, can you treat psychosis? Can you treat hearing voices with weed? And the answer is sort of. If you can isolate that compound that soothes you and get rid of the compound that makes you paranoid, then that would work. So it sounds almost counterintuitive that the thing that possibly causes paranoia, you treat that with that same thing. So I thought we'd get some sort of dismissive comments like Buffy says, I'm Dutch, so I love weed. You might not think, if you consume it yourself, you might think, I don't hear voices, so it's not true. But how it works is, if you have an underlying condition, then it's going to turn up the volume on that. And also, I actually wrote something that's quite important to cover. In some of the peer-reviewed stuff that I've read, they say alcohol or pot, and I think alcohol is a really good example here because a lot of us consume alcohol. A lot of people would say these substances don't enhance what isn't already there, right? So you might say, if you drink alcohol and you have a sense of humor, you're a giggly person, or you have the propensity to be uninhibited, well, alcohol is just going to press those buttons, right? And you might say the same with pot. What I don't like about that argument is it tends to negate the impact of the substance. It's almost like saying, no matter what, you have that capacity anyway. So in other words, someone's saying, well, you've got mental illness anyway, and that substance just brought it out of you, right? I think it negates the impact of that substance, which is to say, everybody knows that somebody consumes a heck of a lot of alcohol. I'm just talking about anybody consuming a heck of a lot of alcohol is going to behave in a bizarre way. And I don't think you can say, yes, but it's because you've got underlying proclivities. I think you're going to say, actually, the substance is starting to have a dominating effect here, right? I think it's a little bit different with pot because it just is different. I think there's more of a, this is really debatable. You could say, no, the stats show that there's far more of a relationship between mental illness and alcohol. But I do think people can use pot in a long-term habitual way where you maybe don't use alcohol in the same way, if that makes sense. I think some people use pot to soothe anxiety, and certainly does have that impact. But the bottom line that I'm trying to get to is that I think the substance can have a huge impact. And if you think I'm just speculating, I'm actually sitting here in a situation where someone very close to me right now, I'm not going to say who it is, but someone very close to me is struggling with literally hearing voices, and it's related to substances. And I'm someone who's not experienced that myself, so it doesn't actually seem real. It doesn't actually seem real that you can hear voices, but you're not crazy. But now suddenly you are crazy. So what caused that? Was the craziness always there, or was the substance creating the doorway for that craziness that was always there to emerge? And the answer is both. When I say mental illness, I'm really talking about the capacity to be out of touch with reality. So in other words, if you have a certain view of the world that's a little bit unrealistic, so for example, in terms of what's going on right now, in terms of politics, in terms of true crime, whatever, if you're generally just a little bit fanciful in your thinking, you tend to jump onto things that are quite unrealistic. If you consume some of these substances, that's going to make that way of thinking a lot worse. So in other words, if you're already out of touch with reality anyway, if there's a certain degree of psychosis there, and once again, it's not everybody else has got psychosis. All of us are capable of a certain amount of psychosis. Then consuming these substances are going to exacerbate that, and consuming them a lot exacerbate it a lot. And so the question is, was Brian? And it's a question. The answer is, I don't know how much he was. People closer to him might know. And I admit this is a very superficial way of looking at it. But one of them is, Brian and Gabby were artists. I'm from an artistic family. I know quite a few artists myself. Art and substances definitely go hand in hand. A lot of artists do use substances. I'm an artist of a sort as well. I'm an author. And before I wrote 100 books, I drank very little alcohol. I'm not an alcoholic. Stephen King made kind of a funny comment where he said, the joke goes something like this: "Are you an alcoholic?" And then he answers, "Well, I'm an author." Almost like, duh, kind of thing. And as I've written 100 books, I've certainly used alcohol to soothe, to slow down my mind, because your mind becomes like a runaway train. And when you finished work for the day, you just need to shut down and go to bed. And I've kind of needed more and more to use alcohol just to shut down the train, empty, to return to a blank slate scenario. And sometimes you're desperate just to shut down the train, it just won't shut down. And so you turn to alcohol, that's what I did. And you can see how that can get worse and worse and worse. Obviously, a simple solution is you just produce less work. You just produce less writing. You just stop writing earlier. But when you are writing compulsively, when you're totally caught up in your work, sometimes I will sit down to write, and the next thing it's the birds are tweeting, and then I carry on 2-3 hours. And when I get chest pains, I feel like I'm going to have a heart attack. Then I stop. Very unhealthy. And then when you want to go to bed, you're like, okay, I need to go and sleep right now. I'll have a glass of wine. It doesn't always work. And then you actually get quite desperate. So I'm just saying how there is a link between the creative impulse and substances. And both Brian and Gabby were artists. I put up quite a few screen grabs from Gabby Petito's Instagram, where she actually references how good the weed is. I think in what state was it? Colorado, somewhere in Colorado, right? And so it is referenced there. I also remember, and I felt quite naive when someone did this. I felt quite naive when I was referring to Gabby being just very calm and something. Do you remember when, and you can actually hear her in the nomadic static video, the one and only nomadic static video that she put up. And she's that sort of video of herself inside the tent, and I think she says hello, hello, hello. Brian and I are just hanging out, and then she takes the camera out and says, "We're doing yoga." And somebody said she's high, and I'd actually not thought of it. I thought that is Gabby. That's Gabby just being Gabby. And I just wonder what you guys think of it. Like, I know a lot of people who camp enjoy camping while having a drink or doing whatever. And so I don't know what you guys think about that. I don't want to make an aspersion that's not true. I'm simply saying what some people have said, and that there is this reference to these things. The thing that I am trying to get to is, was Brian, how much, if this was happening, again, I don't know if it's true for a fact, I'm speculating, but if it was true, how much was Brian using it? Was Brian using it excessively? And one of the things we do know is that pot is used for anxiety. And we know both of them were anxious, and we know even the police said, are you treating your anxiety with any medication? And they said no, but they might not have thought of pot as medication, and probably wouldn't have wanted to mention it to the authorities anyway. The Kitty Cat Network says, I think that was the public persona she wanted to show. So again, I don't know her well enough to say that that isn't just the way Gabby was. That was my perception anyway, that was the way Gabby was. But someone said, well, they saw it, they seem to recognize it as something else. Now, again, I don't know whether it was that way or not, but I think that is quite interesting. I'm not so much making the case that Gabby was using anything. I'm making the case that was Brian, and was this fueling his paranoia. That is the subject, after all, of this live stream. Was that the missing link, that this was actually fueling Brian's paranoia? And it's not just this, it's also insomnia. I've just told you that I drink quite excessively, not like to an alcoholic level or even getting drunk, just more than I would normally drink when I'm writing a lot and I just can't shut down. Well, Brian was also an artist, and did he not just use a different substance? What was that substance? And could that substance be associated with this thing of hearing voices? And I can also tell you, as someone who's written a lot of books, and I want to make it personal. I don't want to make it like I'm pointing the finger and saying that person did that, it's not right. I'm just trying to say, let's try and understand what happened here. Well, let's look at my own experience, look at your own experience, and try and interpret it according to that. So in the times I've had very severe insomnia, and also the times that I've, how can I put it? Stephanie is in the house. Good to see you, Stephanie. Stephanie says, welcome home. You've been missed. Sorry I'm late. Glad I made it in the end. Good to see you. Thanks for that as well. So, so the question is, have you ever had insomnia and your mind's so stimulated, and I won't say you hear voices in a scary way, but there's sort of a chatter in your brain. You've been reading a lot and you almost go to sleep with that chatter still there. And you kind of have conversations and like a reel running in your brain while you're sort of asleep. Have you ever had that experience? Susan H. says affects everyone differently. Amy says, okay. Jeanette says, yes, and my brain revolves around and around. Sweep Singh says, I have chronic insomnia, everything magnifies. You have half dreams, like hyperreal dreams. Now, if you remember Fight Club, and I think the one thing missing from Fight Club is, the story is that he had such bad insomnia that he couldn't tell the difference between reality, what was real and what wasn't real. And everything was a copy of a copy of a copy. And bear in mind, Fight Club is about the world before social media in a way. But what I think is missing in a genuine way from Fight Club is what is the actual source of his delusions there. And I think part of it is mental illness. I think he's got schizophrenia, but I think the other thing is in a realistic scenario is he's probably using certain substances. That aspect is missing from the narrative. But if you are that person, if you're the person, the main character in the Fight Club story, then you are so out of touch with reality that you've got no idea what is really going on. You kind of this pinball that is bouncing around and you're trying to catch up with what is going on. Meanwhile, you do have the split personality and the reasons for it are obvious, but you just don't see it because you're so out of touch with reality. And I must say, thanks a lot, Batman. I've been in this area of treating true crime through the prism of logic and common sense for quite a long time, where you almost put on your Spock mindset and you say, let's be logical about this. Let's anchor everything in reality and in evidence. But there's an alternative universe to true crime. Part of that is the symbolic framework, which is nevertheless still dealing with logic. It's still logical, still psychologically logical. But there's another aspect that I haven't really dealt with very much, and that is the irrational side, where people do things that aren't necessarily rational. I don't like that part of true crime because so many people tend to gravitate towards that anyway. So in other words, a crime will happen and someone will say, I know why that happened. He just snapped. That's why it happened. That's not why it happened. I know why that accident happened. It was an accident. No, there's a reason behind that, a rhyme and a reason. But it is true that there is an irrational aspect to certain behavior as well. I like to think that the reason behind irrational behavior is also rational. In other words, you might say, okay, that's totally irrational, true, but the irrational thing comes from something that makes sense, which is using that particular substance or whatever, if that makes sense, right? So there is the explanation for something that's irrational is rational. Sigrid says being out of work is a risk factor. That's true. Tommy says borderline personality disorder is very impulsive. Okay. Patricia Byrne says there's also willful stupidity. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to go to what I previously scripted for today's video. It's not quite yesterday here. Dealing with hearing voices, and it was the third point in the video that I posted previous to this one. And when I Googled Brian Laundrie hearing voices, I don't know if you Google that, if you'll come up with something different, but my own live video from September 30th comes up as the second thing. It is Brian Laundrie heard voices, struggled with insomnia, and this was posted on the 30th of September on my channel. And it's just not something that comes up very often. I don't see other people really talking about it. So to be fair, I actually lost track of the significance of the whole hearing voices thing. And I'll tell you why it came back onto my radar. I kind of received a couple of screen grabs on WhatsApp from a friend of mine saying, I'm not going to say who it is, this person has been sending me these really weird messages, and can you help or sort it out or whatever. And one of them was, I'm not even going to read it, but basically to do with hearing his voice. And it was so real to this person that this friend of mine actually contacted this person. This person contacted this friend of mine and said, I heard your voice. What have you got to say for yourself? That's how real it is. It's not like you sort of hear voices and there's a chatter. It's literally something that scares kind of the bejesus out of you. It's like something where you think it's actually a voice, right? It's something where, and I'm going to read a real life scenario for you in a moment, where this person tried to escape that feeling by literally leaving the environment they were in and thinking, I'm going to leave the voices behind. That's how out of touch you are with reality, where you think, if I get out of this place, then I'm going to leave the voices behind, only to realize the voices are actually in your mind. So no matter where you go, you're going to take them with you, right? Misdemeanor says hearing voice is not good. Is it schizophrenic? I don't think it is in this case. Michael Elizabeth says, hey, Timmy. Timmy's snoring just over here. I don't know if you can hear him. Sigrid says, like articulated tinnitus. That's quite interesting. Same brain area. Okay, so now I'm going into the area beyond the video that I put up today. And so I later found out that someone else, so I found out that someone close to me is hearing these voices. And then I found out that there was another person that was also, that this person was also hearing that person's voice. So they were hearing consistently two separate voices. SM Kovalinsky says, Brian and Gabby may both have used pot, and it's not unreasonable to wonder. Recent studies have shown psychotic episodes do occur. Many happy-go-lucky people are in fact under the influence. That is what I'm trying to get at. So thanks, SM Kovalinsky, for that. That is what I want to get at, but I want to get to it with kind of specific information. That's quite a general statement, which is true, but I want to be quite specific about it. The Joy Catcher says Chad Abel would say that, but I don't know if he really believed it. Stargirl says, I must say, since taking HRT, I don't have depression. What is HRT? So as I said, this person that I know, this is someone I know from first-hand experience, and it's kind of happening in real time, was hearing two specific voices, right? And I'm not the only person that knows this. Quite a few people know this. And one of the people whose voices she heard was contacted by this person and confronted, only for him to say, no, I never spoke to you. I didn't call you. And he was actually surprised to hear. So this confrontation was really to say, you need to apologize for what you're saying, that you're out to get me. And it was the sense that there's this person that is spying on this other person. I don't even want to reveal if it's a him or a her, because I want to protect the identity. But the bottom line is that there's the sense of this conspiracy and that they're under surveillance, quite a lot like A Beautiful Mind, quite a lot like this sense that I am so important that everyone is watching me, right? And anything I do is being watched, kind of thing. And, if you're just kind of an ordinary person, you're really not that important to spend those kind of resources on. But you can't reason with someone who's lost touch with reality. They are feeling like they're being watched. And have you ever had that feeling of being watched and you actually are being watched? I think many of us have. In this case, it's a feeling of being watched, but you're not being watched. So Peen says, Beautiful Mind was a fascinating movie. And there is someone who's a really intelligent person who kind of figures out that he's suffering from psychosis and manages it, right? So one of the ways that if you're losing touch with reality, that you regain touch is that you recognize that you're losing touch with reality. That's the denial is the best way to maintain this loss of touch with reality. So because this was happening, it really got me to think about, wow, this hearing voices thing is real. It's not just, oh, I thought I heard voices. It's like this real thing that can be quite shocking and scary. It's almost like an auditory hallucination. But and you've had people in the past, I'm talking about mass killers and all sorts of people who say, and I believe them, they say they heard a voice telling them to do something. I don't think that lets them off the hook, but it certainly gives an idea of how seriously out of touch they are with reality when you hear that. And so I started researching what is the classic source of hearing voices. And it is a sign of psychosis, as I said. It's typically associated with coming down from certain substances. And you can Google it, and they list various substances. I was quite interested to see that they listed all of these substances. And then they didn't really include the ones that I wanted to see there, but they do actually include alcohol and marijuana. So you can be a perfectly normal person and you can drink a heck of a lot. And when you're not drinking, you're coming off the alcohol, you can hear voices as well. That's a very easy way of that happening to you. If you consume pot, the exact same thing. If you regularly use pot, use it, and you combine that with insomnia, you combine that with anxiety, you have the perfect cocktail for hearing voices in a way that's not just like a chatter, but it's like, wow, that's going on. And if you take this concept that we're talking about and you apply it to the mainstream movies right now, there's a mainstream movie right now called Dune, where the voice compels someone to do something. So it's literally, has anyone here seen Dune? Put up a 1 if you have, put up a 2 if you haven't. Good. There are two of you that have seen Dune, so someone else as well. Okay, so in Dune, you have this scenario where someone literally uses a voice. So this idea of hearing a voice, but they literally project a voice into someone's mind and that exerts complete control over them. And it's quite amazing how that is presented in the film. So if you're interested in this concept that we're talking about, just go and watch Dune to hear about this. Well, really, Kira, there are no spoilers. I'm just mentioning that part. So the other part that's quite interesting is some people say that Frank Herbert, the guy who wrote Dune, that a lot of his ideas were either stolen or borrowed or whatever by George Lucas, because in George Lucas, the Force is the voice. And occasionally you see the Jedi using this mind trick where they say, let us pass or whatever, we're not a problem, whatever. They speak it and they use the Force, and that then is a voice in the person's head like, oh, wow, I've got to obey. The point that I'm making when I say this is that when we're talking about this hearing a voice, it has such a powerful impact that it's totally disturbing and unsettling to a human being, that it causes their behavior to change, that they start to base their behavior on hearing a voice, right? And so, you've now got substances that are based on your paranoia, substances that are based on your kind of toxic interpretation of your loss of reality, and you are now obeying your own paranoia. You're not observing your paranoia. You are a slave to your own paranoia, which you see in A Beautiful Mind. You see someone trying to escape that slavery, right? I'm just trying to say it's not just a case of you hear a voice and it's not a big deal. It's something that literally changes your reality and you think this is reality. And that is quite shocking if you're someone on the outside looking at it, as I am in a way. And I think it's even more heartbreaking for the person who's stuck in it and doesn't realize they are, kind of thing. How do you know you are crazy? You sort of have that a little bit in the movie Inception, where the guy says, are you in a dream? How will I know how will I tell the difference between a dream and reality? And a lot of the conversation we're having today is about that, are you psychotic or are you neurotic? Are you able to tell the difference between reality, the real world, and the non-real world? The Matrix is about that as well. So many movies are about that. And it is very, very, very scary if you can't tell the difference. And the very, very scary thing is we are living actually in a world where some people are in a reality that is a bit different to ours. And I think we're starting to see that in a way. How do you get people back into the real world? Yvonne Phillips says, this is another missed clue. Batman says, that's $1 million question. Victoria, good to see you here. Beautiful evening from London. Okay, so as I say, it is a sign of psychosis. Psychosis is where you open your mind to all of these irrational possibilities. You are in an increased state of being susceptible to fictions and fantasies that are totally unrealistic, but they feel real, right? In this, usually it's a temporary psychosis. You're really in a problem when that psychosis is sort of set, where it becomes kind of permanent. So, as I said, we know that pot was something that Brian and Gabby probably used, and it's often used by ordinary people to soothe anxiety. We know that they had anxiety, also to soothe ordinary levels of stress. We also know that the anxiety levels increased as the trip increased. So is it possible, is it probable that if they were using something like this, that they were using more of it? I don't have the date here, but around about 110 weeks ago, whatever that is, I think it's about 2 years ago, Gabby was in Colorado Springs and she wrote, there's a picture of her drinking coffee and it looks like quite a artsy sort of environment. It looks like a kind of a coffee shop, but there's some interesting designs around her. What do you call it when you get those prints that are those ink stained prints? What do you call that? When the ink is sort of got a certain name. I just can't think of it. It's associated with, no, not Rorschach, not lithographs. Tie-dye, tie-dye. There's a sort of a tie-dye feel to some of the things that are on the windows. And you know what tie-dye is often associated with. So what Gabby wrote here was, it's so incredible here, the coffee, the weed, and oh my God, the views are like a dream, smiley face. So I think the reference there to weed is something, it's not nothing. And so the question is, if Gabby was regularly using weed or infrequently, whatever, was Brian, and if Brian was, who was using it the most? And we know that Brian seemed to be the more imbalanced person, I think, to put it mildly, between the two. So you could say it's almost like which came first, the chicken or the egg? Was Brian unbalanced or suffering from psychosis because of some substances, or the other way around, right? Amy Bauer says the weed here is strong, I hear. Sackville B says, what if they ran out of weed? Bear in mind, no money, no weed. Excellent point by Susan. So that is people also said, why did Brian take Gabby's money? What did he use it for? Fuel, but also it could also be something else. So I've written here, what we don't know is the amount that was used, even without substances. I don't want to make this all about a substance. In the same way, I don't want to make it all about a disorder. I don't want to say all of this happened because Brian had schizophrenia. Not at all. And I don't want to say all of this happened because of a substance. Just that it's possibly the missing link in what could have made someone so paranoid that his girlfriend's going to leave him, that he took matters into his own hands. That's just the subject matter that we're going into. In other words, he was incredibly paranoid. Where did that paranoia come from? Well, some of it was natural paranoia, and I dealt with that today, where Rose Davis said that Brian was constantly afraid that Gabby was going to leave him. Now you take that constant paranoia, which to some extent is real and rational, because I think Gabby probably eventually would have left Brian if she got to live with him long enough, if the summer epic had gone on for long enough, right? Maybe, maybe not. But I think Brian, there was quite a lot of logic behind the idea that Gabby may eventually leave you. Gabby seemed to be becoming more and more attractive as the months went by. I don't know if Brian was. Brian seemed to be becoming more and more afraid and, I don't know, insecure. So Gabby was growing as a person. Brian was not. So Brian, in a way, was becoming more neurotic. But at the same time that he was becoming neurotic, it's possible that if he took a substance, you would have the psychosis associated with that. So anyway, I don't think it's rocket science to make the argument that jealousy and control were largely part of the dynamic that ultimately cost Gabby her life. But there are jealous and controlling boyfriends all over the place. It doesn't necessarily lead to murder. So I wonder whether the missing link in this case, I suspect the individual involved was not only unusually and unhealthily jealous and controlling anyway, but also losing touch with reality. Losing touch with the reality in the sense that, I think Gabby's leaving me. I think this person's interested in Gabby. And, I think she, when she was on her phone, she was talking to that person. I think she's got second thoughts about me. Consider how emotions and the stakes may ramp up if that ordinary paranoia, and we all know that paranoia when you're a young person. I mean, I can remember viscerally where a girlfriend of mine, so at that time we were together, for whatever reason, I couldn't go out that night. And I mean, it's happened many, many times. And I knew she did go out, and I was so worried that something was going to happen. Like you feel like you're dying and you're counting down the seconds. And then when the person arrives back, what happened? And then no big deal, nothing did happen. And so you have that terrible paranoia, and it feels like your whole world depends on this outcome. But what if that is actually fueled by something beyond the paranoia itself? And so I'm going to cite a case from Here to Help. That's the source, and I'm reading from a real life example. I can actually put a link in chat right now. So it's from a website called Here to Help, Mental Health and Substance Use Information You Can Trust. I think this was published quite a long time ago, 12 years ago. And I think it was written by Anita Smith. So I'm going to put a link to that in chat. Batman says Gabby had the panic attack, cops ignored it. Okay, so this is the pertinent section. I'm quoting from this article. I'll put the link there. Weed, very bad for me. Now, just listen to this and think about these individuals as I go through this. In the summer of 1995, in the summer of 95, at my school, my film school graduation ceremony. Now, bear in mind, this is also a creative person, someone at film school. I thought a helicopter overhead was tracing my whereabouts and that my life was on display, but that delusion was mild compared to what followed once the voices arrived. So just to slow down in what we're saying there, this is obviously a young person. She's talking about a film school graduation, so it's obviously someone in their early 20s, and it's happening in the summer, and it's kind of a simple scenario. There's a helicopter flying overhead, and she's convinced that someone was tracing her whereabouts. So it's that paranoia of surveillance, right? And I wonder whether that paranoia doesn't come from a certain amount of whether it's from parents or friends or society or whatever, a teacher or whatever, that you're not allowed to, or it's sort of frowned on, that you're not really allowed to or supposed to be using this or that or the next thing. And so there's that surveillance that you're aware of. But then when you lose touch with reality, that sort of innate sense of, wow, I'm worried that someone is watching me, becomes just this generalized psychosis, that someone is watching me for who I am, not for what you were doing that led to the psychosis in a way. Sharon Tuck, thanks very much for that. Okay, so Kathy Miller, hi Nick, thanks for all you do. Your videos are fascinating. Okay, so I just want to reiterate that this is about kind of a young person and is getting and says, well, I had this delusion, right? And then she says, this was mild compared to what followed once the voices arrived. So it started with something that she saw, and then it became worse. And the worst thing was the voices. Now, the reason I'm reading this to you is to show you through a narrative, through a real story, what it feels like to be in the situation. And I need to see this because I haven't been in that situation myself. I haven't taken a substance like we're talking about and had voices like we're talking about. So it's hard for me to share that with you when I haven't had it myself. The only way I can do that is through this. Some of you may have had this experience. If you have, maybe you can, Teresa says, don't blame it on the weed. I don't know if you can not. I don't know if you can say the substance is off the hook. I also, by the same token, don't think it's just, there is something, a proclivity towards that, that switch is being flicked. But I also don't think that the switch is flicked if you smoke weed once. I think it's like an accident waiting to happen. That switch is waiting to be flicked, and it eventually is flicked. So if I just go back to what I've just said, she says in the summer of 1995, she saw a helicopter overhead, thought that it was tracing her whereabouts, and that wasn't a delusion, but that was mild compared to what followed. The summer of 95 was the first time I'd ever smoked marijuana. So yeah, she's talking about the first time that she got into this substance, and it immediately led to hallucinations and hearing voices. Teresa says, I think you can prove premeditation. Okay, so she goes on to say, before that, I'd been a straight arrow, hardworking kid, a tree planter, a finance clerk in the Canadian Army Reserves, university student, and now film school grad. But that summer, my life changed. I was living in a house with other students. That's where I was introduced to weed. I started smoking it casually with friends, no big deal. But I can remember even then that I felt people could see me when I was in my bedroom, even if I closed the curtain and door. It felt as though I no longer had privacy, that my life was on record. So you can see that the vein that this goes in, that the track that this goes into, is the sense of paranoia about someone knowing something about you that they shouldn't know. And one wonders whether Brian felt that. One wonders whether Brian felt that that he knew things that he actually didn't know. That's what losing track of reality is all about. That you think reality is something bigger than it actually is. It's far more colorful and elaborate than it really is. I mean, was a helicopter really doing surveillance, or was it like a traffic helicopter, or someone that's a tourist, right? So she goes on to say, after 2 years of smoking pot casually, so there you have a time frame. So she started in 95, smoked it constantly for 2 years, then said, my use increased and became a chronic thing. So what you're seeing here is a chronic user. So this person hearing voices is someone who's a chronic user hearing voices. And I think there's this temptation to think, no, it's got absolutely nothing to do with the substance, or it's got everything to do with the substance. It's kind of a mixture of the two. It's heavy use and also having that switch in your mind that is ready to be switched, right? It's both. She said, I think it was because I was getting sick. I found I was slipping into another world. And what have we been talking about? Losing touch with reality. I found I was slipping into another world, and pot made it so pleasurable, like a waking dream. Now, if we go back to those words Gabby used, she says, it's so incredible here, the coffee, the weed, and oh my God, the views are like a dream, right? Think about the van life trip was like a dream, like going on this constant dream through these dreamy landscapes. Stephanie says, by the way, Lullaby so far is very disjointed. It is a whole other kind of trip. Stephanie, I'd done a little bit of research about the author, and apparently Fight Club is quite a difficult, the writers found it a very difficult book to translate into cinema, I think for the same reason. Bria says, I don't think it would be reasonable to blame what happened to Gabby on something as trivial as weed. I agree with that. But it is at least a good enough topic to bring up, since Brian seemed very paranoid. I'm just trying to add a piece to the puzzle. And it's possible that it's not relevant. It's possible that it's a piece that shouldn't be added. But it's also possible that it's an important piece that we haven't really spoken about before. And that's really what we're trying to get at, because to me, this does tie a few pieces together. So going back to this narrative from Here to Help. It's a Canadian resource. She speaks about becoming a chronic user. And what is a chronic user? Well, in her description, I smoke pot every day during the week. She says I managed to straighten up for a weekend care aid job. I smoked first thing in the morning, right before bed, and any time in between that I could, probably 9 times a day. So for her, a chronic user is someone smoking pot 9 times a day. Then she says, my life started to deteriorate. I decided to live in a van for the summer and then moved into a warehouse space in the downtown east side that had no kitchen or bathroom. I proudly called myself a starving artist, but in fact, I was losing touch with reality. And the stressful street scene in that neighborhood really upped my paranoia. I'm not going to take it any further than that. But what I think is really fascinating with that is that she also ended up living in a van. So it's almost like you could say again, did the consumption lead to living in a van, or did the van life, and that's not quite the same thing as what you're talking about here, enable that kind of lifestyle kind of thing? And I don't know whether to draw an analogy between this and Brian and Gabby. I don't know. I just find it interesting. I find it interesting what is mentioned here, but the pertinent part is that she talks about her paranoia, that she talks about becoming more and more paranoid and hearing voices. And she's not in a situation where she's in a relationship thinking the person's going to leave her, right? And in a situation where there's incredible stress, it can possibly end really badly. There's another article, does marijuana cause psychosis? I'm not going to deal with that here, but I will put a link in the description. You guys can read about that if you're interested. Okay, so I see we are at 1 hour and 37 minutes. I'm not going to deal with Amanda Knox right now. Instead, I'm going to go to Ernest Becker. Are you guys happy with that? We're going to deal with 4 pages of Ernest Becker where he talks about psychosis. And it's really fascinating how he links it to society, the idea of a psychotic society. And I find it not just insightful and enlightening and like a revelation, but I find it incredibly scary. I find it kind of terrifying. I find it kind of terrifying, the idea that you might say that person's psychotic or that person's totally lost touch with society. But think about that concept with an entire society, with an entire nation, where everybody is psychotic. How on earth do you deal with that? Lisa Lewis says, is there any connection between drugs and the couple in Moab? Answer, I don't know. I don't know much. I don't know enough about that case. Okay, so just for your information, I'm reading from The Birth and Death of Meaning, 2nd edition by Ernest Becker. He is the Pulitzer Prize winning author of The Denial of Death. I often cite him in my research, certainly when we deal with psychology, certainly when we deal with sophisticated concepts. I'm reading from a section titled What is Normal? And it's page 151 to 154 of the book. As I say, the chapter is titled What is Normal? And so I'm just going to read here from halfway through page 151, and he writes the following. Each child is in some way dispossessed of his own center. This is the price he pays for becoming human. the paradox of stepping away from animal reflexivity. Each person will twist the world in some way to try to accord it with his fantasies, wishes, fears. He will fail in some way to see obvious things in the world because these obvious things are a threat to him. He will knuckle under some kind of authority, some source of sustaining and transcending power, which gives him the mandate for his life and nourishes his equanimity. Neurosis is a constriction of perception and action due to the need to maintain a positively valued self from within an inferior power position. That's an excellent description of Brian Laundrie. Let me read it again. Neurosis is a constriction of perception and action due to the need to maintain a positively valued self. So in other words, the neurosis helps you make the world smaller. And by doing this, it helps you to hold on to your self-esteem. And think about how Brian doesn't have friends, doesn't want Gabby to have friends, and the van life is just the two of them kind of thing. And so we can flatly and empirically say that everyone is neurotic, some more than others, right? This is neurosis, not psychosis, but we're going to go into that area. The part that I find really interesting is where he says, each person will twist the world in some way. And so that means me. I'm twisting the world in some way that suits me. And so are you. And the fact of that is really scary, because if you take that into a societal context, it means a society can agree to twist the world in a certain way that suits them, but they can be dangerous to other societies. Can you see that? So you may be aware that someone else twists the world in a way to suit them. That's only half of the problem. So do you, and that other person might be seeing you as that. We're all doing it. Do we all know that we're all doing it? Or do only some of us know? So we're now at the bottom of page 151. He writes, the great breakthrough in the contemporary theory of mental illness is that it represents a kind of stupidity, a limitation or obtuseness of perception, a failure to see the world as it is. So that's really a very eloquent and simple way of saying mental illness is just not being able to see reality. Mental illness is just not being able to see the world as it is. And that's why, I talk about true crime and being the most authentic voice in true crime. Being authentic is also seeing the world as it is. Being authentic is also seeing yourself in the world the way you are. Being authentic in terms of true crime is seeing what is happening in true crime the way it actually is. In other words, is that a sighting or is it probably not a sighting? All of these channels, you are like, could it be this? Or is it actually, no, it's not that. It's something else, right? When a question comes up, and I just want to bring it up here quickly. When a question comes up, and this one came from someone called Ya's daughter, how can they tell it was by his own hand, was my question. So Ya's daughter was saying, and it's a test of reality. How on earth can you tell that Brian took his own life using his own hand? How? It's a great question. It's a great test of, well, how on earth can you say that that's reality? And I kind of answered it in the previous video dealing with the statistics that deal with suicide. Most suicides are right-handed. Most suicides are to the right temple, exactly as I'm pointing. And as I'm pointing, that would be the trajectory. So if this is the natural way I would hold a gun, you would expect the trajectory to be like that, right? I don't know if people would hold a gun like that, but you would hold it in a way that would be sort of natural, right? Like that. I can't imagine a lot of people holding it so that they could actually see it. You don't really, if it's held here, you don't see it, right? If it's held here, you do see it, and I think I can imagine it'd be quite scary. And so the trajectory would be indicative of, trigger warning. The trajectory through the skull would be indicative that it's held by his own hand, if that makes sense. And that is how reality is brought to bear on that information. In this respect, someone called Gretchen Dupree, I pinned this post, said that you don't need entrance or exit wounds if a skull was shot. So in other words, you wouldn't need that part of the skull. She says certain things occur with our bodies when trauma happens. I don't know if I fully agree with what she's saying, although I know what she's talking about. There are animals that when they are processed, you don't want there to be a lot of stress because the stress transfers to the tissues. I don't know if I believe that can be transferred to bone. It's possible, I don't know. But anyway, going back to Ernest Becker, he says it is not a disease in the medical sense. He's talking about mental illness. So we talk about someone being mentally ill. Well, are you ill? Think about A Beautiful Mind. Was that person ill? Now, it may be helpful to think of it as an illness, as it can be treated and you can recover. Someone says gun found, ? I think it has been found. I think it has been found, but officially nothing's been said about it. I think the authorities are just, I know an FBI agent was saying she can imagine that the gun is probably being in a lab somewhere being tested. I tend to agree with that, but officially no word on that. So it's not a disease, but I think it may be helpful to think of it as that, right? Bria, they know a gun was missing, so in that sense it was found to be missing, I guess. So bottom of page 151, mental illness is not a disease in the medical sense, but a failure to assign correct priorities to the real world. Now just think about that in terms of Brian. Think about that in terms of paranoia. Think about that in terms of if you are, say, coming off pot, or you suffering from insomnia, just suffering from insomnia on its own, right? A failure to assign correct priorities to the real world. That's what it is. It's not an illness. It's this failure, a cognitive failure. He goes on to, and I just think he's so articulate and so precise, so concise in how he describes this. Bottom of 151, he says, the neurotic bungles small quotas of reality. So well put. The neurotic bungles small quotas of reality. The psychotic large quotas. And remember, at the beginning of this, I said to you that the neurotic limits reality, whereas the psychotic person, someone with psychosis, kind of opens the door. It kind of expands reality to this impossible scale. You know, the helicopter flying overhead is looking at me. Huge scale, but unfortunately not really. And then this is the part that is so mind-boggling and mind-blowing. He says, and so whole societies which fail to act on real priorities for their survival can be said to be psychotic. Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever thought about that you live in a society where your entire society is psychotic? Have you thought of that? Where your whole society is wrong in the way it thinks about reality. Your whole society. That includes everybody. The media, the industrial complex, the military complex. In other words, everybody. Not like maybe there's a minority who are not quite on the right track, but where it's like everybody and you. Have you thought about that? Songbird says, I must read this. Could you say the title again? It is The Birth and Death of Meaning from Ernest Becker's second edition. I'm reading from What is Normal, top of page 152. So I'm just going to go through that again. He says, It is not a disease in the medical sense, but a failure to assign correct priorities to the real world. The neurotic bungles small quotas of reality, the psychotic large quotas, and so whole societies which fail to act on real priorities for their survival can be said to be psychotic. And then he gives an example. So if that's not scary enough for you, he gives this example. And I want you to bear in mind the fact that this novel was not novel, this book, this manuscript, was written in 1962. It says copyright 1971, but 1962. So it's at least 10 years older than I am. It was written 10 years before I was born, right? Before I was born. And some of the things he's mentioning here were barely a blip on the radar of reality then in the 60s. So consider where they are on the blip of reality right now. Listen to this. Now, he's talking about how societies can fail to act on real priorities. And this is the example he's giving in the 60s. Consider how apt it is to today. Listen to this. Top of page 152. Take, for example, a society which puts on one side of the decision sheet the following priorities: potential environmental collapse, possibilities of atomic and germ war on a global scale, possible economic collapse, rumbling social revolution by dispossessed minorities, actual collapse of traditional hero system. That's on the one side. And on the other side of the sheet, escalation of a life-sapping and losing war costing billions of scarce dollars per year in a small, unimportant country of no real strategic value, right? I could read that again, but I'll just leave you guys to go through that. He says, quote, this is page 152, the psychotic choice in this matter would be on the second side of the sheet. And for the past half dozen years, we have seen one of the greatest world powers annually make a choice which completely fouls reality and puts into jeopardy its own well-being and survival. Now, he doesn't mention which nation he's talking about here. As far as I know, Ernest Becker lived in America. I don't know which power he's talking to, but he wrote this in the 60s. You did have the Cuban Missile Crisis taking place around about that time, which I think is quite interesting. But he's referring to the psychotic choice as kind of going to war compared to, well, shouldn't you be focusing on germs and environmental collapse and dispossessed minorities and rumbling social revolution? Shouldn't be worried about that and not on, right? Timmy wants to say hello. I think Timmy's realized this is getting way too intense. Timmy, come. Ooh, yeah. Timmy, are you cold? Hey? Timmy, are you cold? I think he's looking really handsome after his hairstyle, hair trim. It's looking very. I mean, I love him when he's sort of his hairy self, but I think he really looks. He's a really good-looking doggy the way he's looking now. Can you see him? So I'll turn him around a little. Timmy. I know Timmy actually just wants to cuddle. He wants some body warmth. Look at that face. Timmy, come. Okay. Okay. Settling in. Okay. This is very distinguished. Yeah, I agree with that. Okay, now it's just a little bit harder to hold the book. So, So he talks about the psychotic choice in this matter would be on the second side of the sheet. He says, in the light of this, we can today look back with a new tolerance of some cultures as megalomaniac and others as paranoid. Then it goes on to say, it was a scientifically correct beginning, again being revived by courageous young anthropologists. Benedict ran into trouble because it seemed, I'm not going to talk about that. Anyway, it goes on to say, if everyone distorts reality to some degree, it is obvious that everyone is sick, and general standards of normality cannot be matters of clinical judgment, but are instead matters of cultural convention about the range and types of sickness that a society will tolerate. Let me just read that again. If everyone distorts reality to some degree, and think about all of us on social media, aren't we distorting reality to some degree? Do you ever take a selfie where it's just, and you don't think about too much, or how much pageantry goes into a selfie? But just think about your social media and everyone's social media, and this issue where he says, bottom of page 152, if everyone distorts reality to some degree, it is obvious that everyone is sick, right? Not something you often hear, is it? I don't want to read all of this. I'm going to skip through page 153. Then he says, how are we going to complete our task and turn cultural relativism into a liberating scientific weapon? This chapter is about what is normal, and is now trying to find an answer to it. And he says, only now can we fully understand what the answer must be. And so the next page or so are dealing with the answer to what is normal, kind of culturally. He says, the answer would have to be to set up the highest possible standard we could, an ideal standard of health, and use that as a measure, a critique of mental illness. Then the psychiatric nomenclature could be put to its proper use. It would work as an empirical measure within an ideal vision. Now, all of this might sound like gobbledygook, but it's going to make sense in a second. He says, to put it graphically, if we were critical about the game, it would be honest to reveal cripples who cannot play it. But it is hardly a humanistic position to let the whole onus of cultural neurosis fall on cripples. What then would be the highest possible standard? It could be nothing less than the most complete liberation of man from narrowness of perception that prevents him from seeing a larger reality to which he must adapt. So he's basically saying how we can move from being neurotic to normal through this. So let me just go through that again. From narrowness of perception that prevents him from seeing a larger reality to which he must adapt. Just think about that, a larger reality to which we must adapt. That is what Gabby and Brian also needed to do when they were going into the van life thing. They were in a larger reality. They were faced with making a living with the social media, the social media, not constraints, but demands. If they were going to make a living from social media, there was a demand to put up quite a lot more content than they did put up. So seeing a larger reality to which he must adapt from rigid conditioning that prevents his changeability in the face of new challenges, from a slavish rooting in a source of power that constrains him and prevents his own free and independent choice, from uncritical functioning in a Eurosystem that binds his energies obsessively and that channels his life tyrannically for him. This is the sort of thing you need to read a couple of times to get. Anyway, we're now at page 154. I'm just going to read this last paragraph there. And so he says, in other words, the highest possible standard of health for man would be a humanistic critical one. So in other words, humanistic and critical in the sense of being a critical thinker, right? One that would help him develop as a free, self-reliant, independent being. The thing that prevents this kind of development is precisely his automatic conditioning into cultural fictions, which is a kind of psychosis, where you kind of go, you think in terms of cultural fictions. So it's going from neurosis to psychosis, from a limiting experience of life to an unlimited experience of life, but one that's not very realistic. And so in the final paragraph, he says here, and this is so powerful, this is so really incredible, right? And it's so basic as well. He says, the standard of health must at all times be what is real. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that terrible? Isn't that impossible? Isn't that gettable, right? The standard of health must at all times be what is real. Now think about those words in the context to where we are right now. There's talk about a variant in my country, and I know the scientists here are quite upset because they say, well, we were transparent about what's happening and now we're being punished. You know, we're being punished for telling you what's going on. But the situation is we don't quite know the reality of the variant, right? And so the question is, what is real? What is the true nature of it? And that is the test for everything. True crime, what is real? What really happened here, right? And so you might say when you think about somebody hearing voices that, wow, you have a problem, or what problem does this person have? The problem is that it's all of our problems. All of us hear voices to a certain extent, the voices of our own thoughts. And those voices are a interpretation of reality. Is it reality? And you are healthy when the voice you hear is the voice of reality. So I'm just going to read it again. He says, in other words, the highest possible standard of health for man would be a humanistic critical one. So you might say, Cheapers, I don't know what that means. What is a humanistic critical standard? Well, it is asking what is real. Humanistic, what's real to me? Critical, is that real? Right? And think about Brian and Gabby and the scenario of a humanistic critical one would help him develop as a free, self-reliant, independent being. The thing that prevents this kind of development is precisely his automatic conditioning into cultural fictions. And I think Brian may have felt, I'm being conditioned into a social media spiel that isn't me and isn't real, isn't right. As the noted anthropologist Maya Fortes recently so well pointed out, to see what is real is the great evolutionary problem that emerges from transcultural studies, and that comes from 1965. And so the final paragraph here, how can we hope to handle scientifically an evolutionary problem of such dimensions? We who are ourselves culturally shaped in our perceptions of reality, we who are ourselves part of a normal neurosis, who must also struggle in a lie against despair, to this final denouement of our story, we may now turn with some trepidation. So I'm not going to take it further than that, but I thought this is pretty incredible. And I thought it really touched on the topic of hearing voices, psychosis, neurosis, and all the rest, but on the scale of society. So didn't you find that really powerful and meaningful? And it is from a book about meaning, the birth and death of meaning. Songbird says, love this so much, thank you. So I don't know, I kind of got goosebumps reading that by myself, and certainly again when I read it to you guys. There's something really profound when you touch on something like that you can just feel it. You know, it's really powerful stuff. And that's what makes Ernest Becker incredible anthropologist. And you know, he died, I think, at 48 years of age, something like that, younger than me. So one just wonders what he could have achieved, almost like Vincent van Gogh, what he could have achieved if he just lived 10 more years or 20 more years. I mean, the books that he brought out were so profound. And can you imagine what he would have come up with 10 years later? Really incredible. Val says, I got goosebumps too. So I'm kind of done. I'm not going to take it too much further. Just to reiterate, psychosis is losing touch with reality. An extreme form of psychosis is schizophrenia. I don't believe that Brian had schizophrenia. I do think that he was suffering from psychosis because he was a neurotic person, if that makes sense. So because he was neurotic, because his world was so small and he was so limited in his experience, he had this psychotic view, and perhaps that's why he needed to take certain things. I don't know. Then there's also neurosis, which is the constant constricting of reality. Psychosis is associated with seeing ghosts, hearing voices, and being very susceptible to very outlandish conspiracy theories. The last thing I want to do is just refer to these two books. It is something I mean to start on Patreon. I've spoken about it before. I was thinking of doing it every 8th or 9th of every month, just like a particular date, you always do it. But sometimes maybe twice a month, the 18th or the 19th, but patrons only, where we just talk about books. Maybe later on bring it onto YouTube. I just don't think there are enough of you who would really be interested in. I know there are a lot of people interested in the Petito case. I don't know how many of you are really interested in books per se. I could be wrong, but as a result of reading this book, Cry of the Kalahari, by Mark and Delia Owens, I just came across this book on Amazon, where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens, and I just thought I would try it out just because it was so highly recommended. It's on the cover, it says Sunday Times bestseller, unforgettable, vivid and original from The Guardian, a rare achievement, The Times, over 5 million copies sold worldwide. And so a lot of the praise that this book got made me think I'm interested. And then I think I went and I read the sample, and I'm just going to read. I hope it's okay that I do. I'm just going to read from the prologue, 2 paragraphs from the prologue. I hope that's okay. From where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. And this is just a taste of what we'll probably do with the book club on Patreon. And why I find this so profound is I'm a writer, and I sometimes read books and I just can't access them. You know, I just find it too contrived, too shallow, too uninspiring. And then a book comes along where every word is like magic. And this is, to me, a book like that. For whatever reason, every word resonates. And I don't know whether this will resonate with you, but let's see if it does. So I'm reading from the prologue, just 2 paragraphs from Delia Owens, Where the Crawdads Sing, and it refers to 1969, and this is how it opens. Now, the reason why this is going to catch with you is because of what you just dealt with Brian Laundrie, right? Just where he was. And this is a fiction, but it brings to life the swamp, the marsh, the wetland, the water, the earth, and all that. So this is from the prologue. Listen to this. Marsh is not swamp. Marsh is a space of light where grass grows in water and water flows into the sky. Slow-moving creeks wander, carrying the orb of the sun with them to the sea, and long-legged birds lift with unexpected grace, as though not built to fly, against the roar of 1,000 snow geese. Then within the marsh, here and there, true swamp crawls into low-lying bogs, hidden in clammy forests. Swamp water is still and dark, having swallowed the light in its muddy throat. Even night crawlers are diurnal in this lair. There are sounds, of course, but compared to the marsh, the swamp is quiet because decomposition is cellular work. Life decays and reeks and returns to the rotted duff, a poignant wallow of death begetting life. And then on the morning of October 30th, 1969, the body of Chase Andrews lay in the swamp, which would have absorbed it silently, routinely, hiding it for good. A swamp knows all about death and doesn't necessarily define it as a tragedy. I'm not going to read further than that. I just think that this is so really well written, and that's just from the prologue. I've always felt that excellent writing takes things that are normal and, taking a narrative and that it becomes prose, that it becomes that an ordinary description becomes poetry. And I've always felt that is powerful writing. Is it necessary to be so dry in your description? Is it necessary to be so bland? Or can you transform the common thing into something that is what it is? It's real, but it's nevertheless astonishing, right? So I'm not going to take it further than that. I'm at 2 hours, 11 minutes. I actually thought I would be done by 2 hours. Songbird says, wow, very relative to the case. Mr. Mina says, thanks so much for this live, broadens our thinking. Mrs. Kelly says, hello. Well, Mrs. Kelly, you are just in time to say goodbye. I wonder if I must wake Timmy up. Robin says, your books are poetic, Nick. Right now I'm narrating the second treachery book. I've really got a long chapter that I've got to get through. But I think I did venture into the prose aspect with treachery 1 and 2. I thought it was necessary as well. Brian Cullen says, thanks. Thank you, Brian. Molly, not sure how to say your surname. Not even going to try, but thank you for that. Mrs. Kelly says, sorry, so late, just woke. Mrs. Kelly, are you in Australia? Pian Puckfist says, always thought-provoking. Glad you're back, thank you. Thanks, Margie. Thanks, Janelle. Thanks, Stephanie, for making it. Are there any other questions? I just want to see if I've put anything else here to touch on. Any other questions? Any other comments? Corin Corcoran says, I'm a new subscriber. Thank you. Stephanie says, look forward to watching back what I missed. I hope you find it interesting. Patricia says, good to have you back and looking fab. Thanks. Do I look a little tanned? I certainly did catch quite a lot of sunshine. Susan says, nice to see you, Nick, Timmy, mods, and rockets. See you next time. Yeah, thanks a lot to the mods. Stephanie, Bria, Sharon, I think, is still here. Terry Dean says, thoughts on premeditation. My only thoughts on premeditation are that I wouldn't be surprised if the idea occurred to Brian more than once. So almost like an impulse, almost like a flash in different situations where he was feeling frustrated, where he was other situations where he felt like he's in the process of losing control. I also think that it may have weighed on him the possibility of Rose coming to join them. I think he dreaded that, and I think if that was brought up, that he really didn't want to be part of that, and he may have felt that would replace him, and if he was paranoid enough, that could really have been a trigger. I thought that was quite an interesting addition from the narrative that we know. I thought that was quite an interesting addition to a story that all of us feel that we know quite well today. Corin Corkum says, I'm from Louisiana and love crawdads. Okay. Cynthia Burke says, thank you, Nick, mods, and everyone. Terry Dean, I've thought that too, especially when he flew back to Florida and left Gabby alone. what did he really want from the storage locker? I think the lawyer says that I can't quite remember what he said. I think the lawyer said, whether you want to accept that or not, said that they decided to extend their trip. I don't know whether he was getting equipment for that. It could have been blankets, it could have been like speed sticks or computer equipment. I don't know. Was it something for their trip, or who knows? Susan Timmerman, nice live, Nick and Timmy. P.N. Puckfist says, I agree that the arrival of Rose set him off. Jean Karras, good to see you here as well. I just want to thank you as well for moderating. Were his guns in the storage locker? I think he only had one gun, but I would assume not, and I don't think he flew with it either. Mika says, if Brian was truly a control freak, do you really think he would leave his girlfriend behind? Yes, I think when you may have felt he was done, but it could also have been something completely different. He may have felt, Gabby may have said, I have to get a video up, and, don't you have something to do? It could have been something like that. Snowline says, very behind in the live stream, but I love that sort of writing because I myself write poetry. That's pretty cool. Okay, I think that's it. It's Micah. Okay, got it. Terry Dean, thank you so much for sharing your genius so willingly with us. Well, I think the genius there was Ernest Becker. He really is quite an amazing mind. But thank you for that. I'm going to wake Timmy up so he can say goodbye to you. He's got to get off my lap anyway. Yeah. Timmy, you must say goodbye. Timmy, you must wake up. Timmy. Timmy's like really half asleep. Timmy, are you hearing voices? Right? Hear my voice? Okay, guys. Sometimes he doesn't listen, which is not always a good thing. Well, I think he's just like a child. They decide what they're going to listen to and what they can get away with. Oh, the guy in my profile pic is named Tim. Okay, interesting. Cynthia says, Ernest Becker really does have an amazing mind. Okay, guys, Timmy says goodbye. Timmy, you must say goodbye. Bye-bye. And I'll see you guys next time. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for all the super chats. And I'm not sure if I'm going to be here tomorrow, but thank you guys for tuning in, and I'll see you guys next time.